Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on ending homelessness in California. I'm Catherine Bracey, founder and CEO of Tech Equity Collaborative. We are waiting just a couple of minutes to let the room fill up, and we'll get started momentarily. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on ending homelessness in California. I'm Catherine Bracey, founder and CEO of Tech Equity Collaborative. We are just giving the room a couple of minutes to fill up. We will start momentarily. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this conversation about ending homelessness in California. I'm Catherine Bracey. I'm the founder and CEO of Tech Equity Collaborative. Thank you for being here. Before we start, for those of you who are not familiar with Tech Equity, just want to give you a quick intro to who we are and what we do. We are a startup nonprofit in the Bay Area that is mobilizing tech workers and companies around issues that we think will make it so that as the tech economy grows in California, more people are benefiting from that growth, and that the tech-driven economy is creating broad-based opportunity and not driving inequality and displacement. And we do that in three ways. We do educational events like this one and other educational programming that helps people in the tech industry understand the issue set. We do public policy advocacy, so mobilizing tech workers and companies around a public policy agenda that will help build a more inclusive economy. And we partner with tech companies to help them develop more ethical practices in our issue areas, which are housing, of course, which is the topic we're going to cover today, but also workforce and labor. Speaking of corporate partners, this event is actually sponsored by AppLovin, which runs a program called AppLovin Cares. And one of their values is that they understand as members of our communities that we need to be part of the effort to help those communities succeed. And obviously that's very aligned with what Tech Equity's mission is. And so we're very grateful to have their support for advancing really important conversations like the one we're going to have today. Before I introduce the panelists, just a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, we have a code of conduct that we enforce for all of our events, virtual or in person. Herman, our community manager, will post a link to the full code of conduct in the chat, but essentially it says to please respect everybody here, assume good faith, and do your part to ensure that this is a safe space for learning. We are going to be having a Q&A at the end of the webinar, about 12:40 or 12:45. But if you have a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function, to post your questions for the panelists that we will be sorting through at the end. If you want to chat during, we have left the chat open. Please feel free to engage there. But note that if you have a specific question that you want posed to the panelists, please use the Q&A function. Also, if you work in tech, we'd love to have you more engaged in our work on an ongoing basis. You can sign up to become a member or to get more information about how to get involved and take more action on the issues like the one we're going to talk about today. Herman will also post some links down there in the chat, and also a link to follow us on Instagram, where, if I do say so myself, we have some really cool content. So with that, we're going to jump into the conversation with our great panelists. We're talking about a topic today that I know, if you live in California, is very front of mind, has been front of mind for many years, and is becoming an issue that is top of the national agenda, as well as we sort of emerge, if that's what you can call it, from the first phase of the pandemic and the eviction moratorium ends, as the housing market, both on the rental side and the home buying side, gets further out of reach for many people. Homelessness is becoming a topic that's relevant, not just in high cost of living places like California, but across the country. And we think this is a really important time to revisit this question of how we can end homelessness once and for all. So we're going to talk to three really engaging experts on this topic. I'm going to, introduce each of them one by one with a kind of short conversations with each of them, and then we're going to all talk together. And first, I want to talk to Aras Jizan, who's the head of data and technology for the Built for Zero initiative at Community Solutions. Built for Zero is, I guess I would say, it seems very like a simple concept, but is really a bold undertaking to end homelessness once and for all. I'm wondering if you can talk about what that vision is specifically, and how you've achieved that goal in cities across the country, but also in California. I know y'all have done some work in Bakersfield.
Thanks, Catherine. So as you said, Built for Zero is sort of a national initiative. We work with over 90 cities and counties across the country. For reference, it's about a quarter of the country that I got the chance to work with and learn from. And so, a lot of that initiative is focused on reframing how communities are approaching the problem of homelessness. And at the most basic level, for me, I think the frame of reference that I use here is that at the person level, we've got a clear evidence base around how we can help one household or one individual resolve their experience of homelessness if they're in a housing crisis. But at the systems level, I think we're still building that evidence base. And so what that means is that, like any other complex problem where there's lots of dynamic variables, we have to approach the problem in a different way. Less of a recipe and more of a playbook. And so to me, the three key elements of that playbook are that we start with a clear end state measure. So what is the goal here? How will we measure whether we're making progress towards ending homelessness? How do we define an end to homelessness? Is there a quantitative measure, qualitative? And how do we think about that also, crucially, in terms of equity, right? And making sure that equity is baked in to that end state measure. Next, we need quality data to be able to track progress towards that end state, right? So, if we think of it in terms of feedback loops, we have to have some way that we know whether what we're doing is moving the needle, and moving the needle as defined by getting us closer to that end state goal. And then lastly, you need to iterate based on the data, right? So we need to make sure the system response is not set it and forget it, but it's plan A, and then we're looking at the data, and then we're moving to plan B, or doubling down on plan A if it's working. And so again, like you said, nothing revelatory. This is how we approach most problem solving in life. It's just that for a variety of structural reasons, it's tough to tackle a big societal problem like homelessness in this way.
Well, so that you said something really interesting, which is we know how to solve this at the individual level. And so my sort of uninformed, logical next thought is, okay, then just do that thing for the number of people that are homeless and we've solved the problem, right? So like, why isn't that just the answer?
Such a good question. So I think that, to me at least, there are two main reasons why it's hard to scale up those person level interventions to solve the problem once and for all. So the first piece is that
and actually, can you just say, like, what is, like, we know what the solution is at the individual level, what is it? And then, sorry, just to clarify.
No, absolutely. It's really important. So to me at least, and other folks on the panel, I'm sure, will be able to layer onto this. At the person level, we know, super obvious, when somebody is experiencing homelessness or they're in housing crisis, housing first. What they need is housing. And then hopefully we're able to wrap around services to ensure that the person's other social and health needs are met. But housing is a linchpin there. And I think we have lots of sort of social work and clinical models that sort of have a go-to model or approach for supporting individual people based on their needs, or households based on their needs. So I think we do actually have a really solid evidence base there, and a number of sort of credible journals have published articles about the validity of Housing First as a model for supporting individual people. I think the back of the envelope sort of metric that is often referenced here is that there's something like a 90% retention rate when somebody is sort of supported with permanent supportive housing, regardless of what their underlying needs or situation might be. The evidence base is really strong that deployed sort of effectively with housing and crucial supports, we're able to support individual people or households to resolve their experience of homelessness and stay in safe and stable housing long term. But I think that when you think about scaling that across a population, you start to run into some structural barriers or challenges. So to me, one of the foremost among them is that the problem is dynamic. So the people who are experiencing homelessness in a particular jurisdiction today are going to be different than a month from now or a month ago, right? It's a fluid, dynamic problem. So some of this is about access and connecting with people and big coordination challenges that come with doing that, especially in large urban or rural geographies. So that's one piece of the puzzle. I think the other piece is that, we've designed sort of a Rube Goldberg machine, like sort of a big house of cards in terms of how a lot of our response systems are designed. And so it's hard then to have the information that we need to be able to credibly move forward and make progress and be dynamic in our approach to solving the problem. So again, I think even when folks have that shared aim that I talked about earlier as sort of a crucial first step, I think a lot of the work that we support communities to do and that folks across the country are doing is to think about how we reorient systems to make it easier to have quality data about the sum total of people experiencing homelessness in a jurisdiction, and then to be able to be responsive to that data if what it's telling us is that we need to pivot service delivery or stand up new programs or projects and so on.
And so you have been successful at getting to zero or close to zero in some places in the country. Maybe you could talk about the Bakersfield example since we're talking about California in this conversation, but I would just be curious to know, like, how does that actually work?
Yeah, absolutely. So the leaders in Bakersfield were able to make massive progress, starting with focusing on chronic homelessness. So folks who are experiencing long-term homelessness with a disability. And those folks can speak better to their experience on the ground. And I think there's been pretty good press coverage. But a lot of what that looked like was reorienting partnerships in the community level, focusing on looking at, I mean, it feels really obvious, but looking at actual data on how many people are experiencing chronic homelessness, not just year to year or in sort of a strategic planning mode, but in a tactical day over day, week over week, month over month, right? Letting the data be your guide around who are the people, what are their needs, and then aggregating that and making sure that we're also looking at it through an equity lens to say, let's make sure that a rising tide or improvements at the system level are actually sort of equitably resulting in improvement in outcomes across the board. And lastly, I think a really crucial piece here is that these systems, we all have sort of decisions to make because we're operating sadly often in a resource constrained environment. And so that scarcity means that similar to an emergency room, when I show up, they're using information about me and information about all the people in the emergency room to make triage decisions about resource allocation and prioritization. Same story here, right? In a perfect world, I think we wouldn't have to do as much triage. And the good news is that for a variety of reasons, we're moving towards a world where there's less resource scarcity. But for today, at least, we don't have the ability to give a full rental subsidy or voucher to everybody who we know qualifies for one, let alone everybody who's experiencing housing instability. And so we need some way to sort of do that triage in real time. And the reality is that no one person, one agency, one actor can do that on their own. It really requires a bunch of partnership work and reimagining ourselves as part of one sort of shared effort or movement at the local level.
Yeah, so Jason, that's actually a good transition over to you, Jason Elliott, who you are the senior counselor on housing and homelessness for Governor Gavin Newsom. You're sort of helping to look at this from a statewide level. And in terms of this question about how do we, what are the capacity and resource constraints? That's obviously been a huge issue in California for, the last decade at least. But COVID presented an interesting opportunity, I guess, to kind of take advantage of a crisis and really put in place some emergency measures that could address the issue in the short term, but maybe potentially address the issue in the long term as well. So I'm wondering if you can just talk first a little bit about your role, how you work, and then B, to introduce us to the project that has come to be called Project Roomkey, what it is and what role you think it has in solving the homelessness crisis.
Sure. Thanks for having me this afternoon, and thanks everybody for signing on and spending your lunch hour with us. So I think let's set a frame here first, right? Which is, how do you comprehensively once and for all address homelessness? I mean, that's the question we're seeking to answer, right? Individual level, systems level. Tamika is going to talk a lot because I do panels with Tamika a lot, and she has a deep insight and expertise into changing systems to get better outcomes, as opposed to just focusing on the outcomes, which can be a little more temporal. So, I want to let Tamika, who's the best voice in California, speak to some system change stuff. But let me just set a context, okay? What do we need to do to end homelessness? We need more housing, we need more services, we need more social supports, we need a better education system, and 77 other things. The answer is we need every single one of those things, because homelessness is poverty, right? So the question is, how do we solve poverty? Every single one of those good ideas that people on this panel have, the answer is yes, we need that. But let's set context for a second. In America, if you are hungry and poor and you qualify for food stamps, you get food stamps. Now, the benefit may not be rich enough. Maybe it doesn't cover enough different kinds of groceries and organic produce, but if you're hungry and poor, you get food stamps. If you're sick and poor, you get healthcare. A lot of issues with Medi-Cal. It's not a perfect system, but it's available to everyone who qualifies. If you need a housing voucher in America, you have a 1 in 5 chance of getting. That's the problem, right? Let's be clear about what the problem is. And that's not something that we in California can fix. And frankly, it's not something that Joe Biden, who is deeply committed to this and is working overtime right now in Washington to close these budget deals, even he can fix overnight. But let's start with the premise that the social safety net has a massive gaping rip in it. Okay. So we all have to work together. We all have to advocate together. We all have to do everything we can to create universal vouchers, right? You want a magic bullet? That's your magic bullet. You start there. We're going to make progress towards that. And in the meantime, that doesn't obviate the responsibility and the need to actually do something right now. So the question is, what can we do right now? And, I think my job working for Governor Newsom is to think about what can we do now and what can we set ourselves up to do tomorrow. We don't run Congress. We don't run the White House. We can advocate, but what can we do right now with the tools we have at our disposal? And, in the context of, I work on, among other things, housing and homelessness, because frankly, those aren't two different things. I mean, they're two different things, I suppose, in terms of how we silo them in academia or what have you, but they're not two different things, they're the same thing. So we have to talk about, how do we just get as many people into housing as quickly as possible? Look, this is not a political event, and so I'm not going to do a stump speech here, but we're in the middle of a recall. And let me just say, the Republicans that want to be governor are almost every single one of them against the concept of housing first. They believe almost to a T that we should make people earn their way into housing through sobriety, through work requirements, through behavior modification, whatever the heck it might be. We disagree with that with every single bone in our body. The governor, when he was mayor, Tamika worked with us when we were in City Hall, early champion of housing first, and remained deeply and unmovably committed to that concept. Okay, so what does that mean? Housing first. Now what? Housing can be a lot of things. It can be shelter. Shelter is, and I'm using housing in a broad sense, get someone inside, try to start dealing with those issues. It can be permanent housing. It can be a voucher, private pay. It can be stabilizing a family and making sure that mom can get back on her feet to earn a living to participate in the private market and rent an apartment. There's a lot of it. It can be conservatorship housing for people with deep behavioral health issues. It can be all those things. It is all those things. So we have to provide investment and leadership in all of those phases. So Catherine, you mentioned Project Roomkey. Project Roomkey is non-congregate shelter. In the wonkery of this space, congregate shelter is exactly what it sounds like: a bunch of people congregating in one big space, cots in a convention center. Non-congregate shelter is the opposite of that. It's basically motel rooms or other sort of partitioned private spaces. Non-congregate shelter is just better. I mean, and it's intuitive that it's better. Who wants to be in a bunk bed with someone they've never met before when they can be in a room by themselves? It's just intuitive. Whatever you and I would want, people experiencing homelessness want. There's no difference, right? Non-congregate shelter is better because of COVID. I don't know that I have to explain much more about that. So Project Roomkey is a massive, we started at 0 miles an hour and we accelerated in, I mean, unprecedented short amount of time. We launched Project Roomkey in April of 2020, right when the pandemic was starting. And within a month or two, our local governments had sped up and provided 17,000 leased motel and hotel rooms. That number has fallen off a bit as the pandemic has sort of normalized. Project Roomkey has served more than 42,000 people experiencing homelessness since the beginning of the pandemic. The number is quite a bit higher, but we're still deduping some data, but it's at least 42,000 people. Our point in time count on any given night, as flawed as that methodology might be, tells us there are about 168,000 people experiencing homelessness on any given night in California. So to put it in perspective, 42,000 served over the course of Roomkey, about 170,000 people homeless in any given night. 42,000 people sheltered. We increased the entire shelter capacity in California by 50% with this program. And yet we're nowhere close to comprehensively solving homelessness because shelter is shelter, it's not housing. So what are we doing for housing? That's what we call Homekey, similar to Roomkey, named similarly because they're similar programs. Homekey, and I see some friends on this Zoom that have implemented Homekey in their communities. So pardon me for telling you something you know already, but we give money to local governments and then they buy things, hotels, motels, tiny homes, vacant apartment buildings, commercial buildings, convert those, create that permanent housing. So it's a continuum. It's not just shelter and it's not just housing. It's everything in between. Today, as it happens, and then Catherine, I'll stop here because I'm filibustering. Today, as it happens, a team of ours was down in Los Angeles launching the Notice of Funding Availability, the NOFA, for my government friends on this call, the NOFA for Homekey 2.0. The governor just passed a $12 billion homeless package. Within that $12 billion homeless package is about $6 billion for these acquisitions and creation of new housing. Within that $6 billion is a $2.75 billion pot to do the second round of Homekey that we, as I just discussed. 14,000 units we expect to create with that. And urgency, speed, CEQA waivers, land use waivers, all of that is in the law. And so we're providing these resources. The NOFA launches today as it happens. So there's a timely aspect to this. We want to get this money out as quickly as possible and start as quickly as possible. When I talk quickly, homeless housing is usually 2, 3, 4 years to a move in. We're talking 6 months, right? That's the time frame we're looking at here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that has been the, for those of us who've lived in California for years, the thing that was kind of striking about Project Roomkey was like, oh, it is actually possible to move faster on solving this problem when we are galvanized behind it. So, that's great, I guess, but it is also, it makes you question, like, what are the political dynamics that were preventing us from doing it in the first place? And how do we know that those aren't gonna come up and prevent us from scaling or making this a sustainable project that isn't just an emergency response?
It's a fantastic question. And the answer is we're not going to bat 1,000. So let's get as close as we can to that, right? And I think if you diagnose the reasons that local governments don't want to move more aggressively to create these solutions, you can kind of simplify. It's oversimplification. You can simplify it down into 3 things. Resources, right? Law and political will. Resources, as I mentioned, $12 billion we're spending in the next 2 years on homelessness. Resources up to this point, we've been arguing about 200 million or 300 million. That's sort of been the zone we've been in. We're talking 12 billion. So the challenge here is making sure we spend the money, not scratching for pennies. Law. I'd say you diagnose the challenges. Really, it comes down to land use and CEQA in the context of homelessness.
Can you
And
say for people who don't know what CEQA is, the like?
well,
10
if you don't know what CEQA is, God bless you, and I don't know that I want to actually inform you about what it is, but it's the environmental rules that that are intended to protect communities and intended to protect the environment from development and other sorts of projects. In the case of homelessness, it provides an opportunity for local communities to appeal or push back on homeless housing, which in some cases is an appropriate pushback, but in many cases it's not.
Got it. Yeah, it's sort of been weaponized as a tool for NIMBYs to prevent things from getting built.
And in the case of services and housing for people experiencing homelessness, there's an even more acute level of fear in a community about what those kind of people will bring to your community. Now, misplaced, but frankly, that's what we're dealing with. That tees over into the land use conversation, which is to say that Homekey says any project that's receiving money from Homekey is effectively exempt from local zoning that would otherwise prohibit it. I mean, that's a big deal, right? That's a big deal. If you ask me why was Homekey 1.0, the round we just concluded, 6,000 units, why was it successful? There's like 55 reasons, but I would say that the number one reason is that land use waiver, right? Which is if a hotel, we bought a lot of hotels with Homekey round one. Those are zoned in commercial areas or tourist areas that don't allow a housing use. So a community can say, hold on, we're not going to do that rezoning. We're not going to allow housing there. That's a downtown core. But because of the law that the governor wrote and the legislature adopted, that is no longer a barrier for Homekey. We have removed that as a barrier. So that's around those law clearances. And then the final point is around political will. And I'll just make a quick point. Ezra Klein wrote a really good piece a couple weeks ago, last week. I don't know, time is a flat circle when you're in a recall. And he talked about how there's been a change in the ethos of California, which is now it is no longer acceptable to be against housing, right? People, and this is in Ezra's words, people have to at least pretend to be for it and then find excuses to be against it, right? And so there's something shifting in the world here around housing. And look, on Homekey 1.0, last point I'll make, Homekey 1.0, Oakland did a great job, San Francisco did a great job, LA, San Diego, some of the places you would assume that do a great job, did a great job on Homekey. They were aggressive, they stepped forward, great projects. So it's good. But I think what is more interesting here is what's happening in Lompoc and in Nevada County and in Mendocino and in Imperial, these places that have not otherwise stepped up for whatever reason, they're implementing Homekey. So something's changing. We're seeing rural California. Fresno has been one of our best counties in implementing Homekey. Fresno County. So something's changing. And so I think all of the parts are there: money, law, and political will. I think everything's aligning.
So actually, I want to talk to Tamika because you've been in the wars on the politics of this for a long time. You are founder of All Home, which I hope you will introduce yourself, but also, just so people know, previously served as chief of staff to Oakland's Mayor Libby Schaaf. So you have seen this from multiple angles, had a front row seat on this issue. So I'm wondering, just first of all, why and how you founded All Home and what All Home does and what aspect of the problem it attacks, but also how you think about this systemic and political question that we've been talking about here and sort of circling around for the last few minutes.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And Catherine, thank you so much for having me today. It's really awesome to be in conversation with my colleagues on this call and all of you. So as you mentioned, I look young, but I've been at this game a long time. I've been working in the Bay for over 18 years, both in the public sector, as you mentioned, in both with then Mayor Newsom, Mayor Lee, and Mayor Schaaf, but also as a direct practitioner running Hamilton Families, working directly with families experiencing homelessness. And so as I was doing that work over the years, it really became clear to me that no one jurisdiction was going to be able to solve this crisis on its own. As Jason and Iris both have talked about, this is a poverty problem, but it's also a regional problem. People move throughout the region and are not bound just by the arbitrary lines of our counties and cities. And so when you have people experiencing a housing crisis in San Francisco and are rehoused as far as Sacramento, because that's the first place that they can find affordable housing. We have a problem in our region in terms of having enough housing to that extremely low income people and formerly homeless people can afford. So we first have a math problem. The Bay Area housing shortage and frankly, housing shortage statewide has exacerbated this crisis, because homelessness is not just driven by what people believe to be individual failures, mental health and substance abuse challenges, and all of the other behavioral challenges that people witness when folks are having a psychiatric emergency on the street. It is really driven by the fact that there is insufficient housing supply across our region, and subsequent services, both social services, but also economic opportunities. How do you actually pay for your housing? You pay for it by having income. And if incomes have been stagnant in your household or in the region or in the state, and housing prices have soared over the last decades, you're going to see more homelessness in your communities. So when I was confronted with this reality, I felt like there was a gap in having a voice that figured out how to bring cities, counties, community-based organizations, people with lived experiences, our business leaders, everybody in the ecosystem that cares and is responsible for addressing this crisis. We needed a regional strategy that allowed us to work across geographies, that allowed us to assess how are we spending our resources toward these problems in a coordinated, best practice and data-driven fashion. So that was the impetus for starting All Home. And we've been operating for nearly 2 years, really trying to work directly with communities in strategizing how, in fact, they are spending their resources today and tying those resources to actual outcomes of reducing homelessness in their communities. And I'll give you a very specific example. When I was the chief of staff to the mayor of Oakland in 2015, we developed a citywide housing strategy, first of its kind. And as we were looking at all of the elements of the housing strategy to provide affordable housing for everyone who needed it, homelessness was not a top priority in that plan in 2015. This problem has grown exponentially in communities throughout the region and throughout the state for issues related to our economy and the imbalance of housing supply. So I think it's really important for folks to understand that it's not just about housing folks. Aris talked about this. We know how to house people, but unless we figure out the other interrelated and intersectional issues that are keeping homelessness in place, I think that's where we're falling short.
So you, sorry, were you gonna, I thought you were.
I just was gonna say one other observation relative to your second question about sort of the political and systemic issues that we face. There are two things that my experience and realization have sort of guided me in. I don't believe that the Bay Area has ever designed a vision or a strategy or set of strategies that believed homelessness was actually solvable. I think communities have been maintaining this crisis. If people come, they serve them. We measure our success by number of people served, not actually by reducing the population level impact on the ground. When you walk on your block in Oakland, are you seeing fewer people experiencing the unsheltered homelessness? So I think part of our challenge is that we have never imagined that the problem can be solvable, and we're intimidated by the price tag around what it actually would take to get right-sized to resource the problem now that it has grown so significantly. Jason talked about the governor's $12 billion investment, which is extraordinary. It is unprecedented that at the state level, we've seen this level of investment in this issue. However, All Home conducted a year-long process to come up with a regional plan to reduce unsheltered homelessness by 75% by 2024. And the price tag just for the Bay Area for our 9 counties is about $6.5 billion. So when you think about scale, we have to think about ongoing investments toward this issue because we didn't get here overnight. And we're not going to get, as Jason said, you can't bat 1,000 when you've had decades of disinvestment in your housing supply and, frankly, social safety nets that really support people who are experiencing housing crises in their communities. And then the piece around who this is happening to, Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks are disproportionately impacted by this crisis. We're not talking about everybody in our community. We're talking about systemic racist housing policies, economic policies, and others that have perpetuated the impacts for our communities of color. So if we're going to tackle this issue, we should build on the racial awakening that folks now have around systemic racism and how it affects our entire quality of life, and impart those solutions in how we are trying to solve this crisis.
That's a really good point. And actually, we did an event on the Black homelessness a few months ago that I'm hoping Herman or Marion can post a link to in the chat. I really recommend that people watch that and go follow the resources that we outlined in that conversation. You kind of alluded to something that is on my list of questions. It's kind of far down, but you said it, and it's definitely something we need to address given who we are as tech equity, about the economic components and the stakeholders you bring to the table, and you use the word responsibility. What role do you think the tech industry has to play in this problem or in exacerbating the problem?
So, All Home's position and really the design of our mission is that housing and economics are inextricably linked. We cannot continue to build housing that is out of reach for people earning less than $35,000 a year, which is over 1 million people in our region, in the Bay Area, within this pandemic environment, and not look at their access to quality, competitive jobs. And for me, it really is, how do we engage our employers? And our tech partners are one sector of our employers who have a tremendous role to play, not only in some of the work that Facebook and others have been doing, Google, around their housing funds, really trying to figure out how do we provide access to capital, low-cost loans to build and increase the supply. But my question is always to businesses, whatever your sector, is how do we create pipelines of opportunity for extremely low-income workers to access competitive jobs and skill development that actually increases their household incomes and gives them a shot at being able to pay their rent and other living expenses every month. So we think that there is a really direct opportunity for tech companies and others to utilize the assets that you actually bring, which are jobs, to figure out how to create opportunities for 50%, Catherine, of the people who are earning less than 30% of the area median income are employed. And they are still experiencing homelessness because the jobs are not enough to meet the cost burden that they have living in the Bay Area. So I think first, figuring out how you can partner with communities around job access. And then the second is technology resources. You heard Aris talk about poor quality data. One of the things that we see in our work at All Home is how challenging it is for our local governments and community-based organizations to have data systems, data hygiene, the sort of technology infrastructure to be able to coordinate services and programs across geographies. I think that's a really unique role for the technology industry to play, is partner with us on building some of these platforms, utilizing what really works and helping us coordinate our efforts across the region.
Yeah, and if I can editorialize for a second, I mean, I think that, we started Tech Equity 6 years ago. trying to get a tech company to understand that, solving homelessness was part of their responsibility was like a crazy idea. Now, at least they are willing to have that conversation and understand, okay, we have to do something about this, whether they are excited about that or not. And many of the big companies have put up a lot of money, to your point, and to Jason's first bucket of, resources they've committed there. But where they're not, we haven't gotten them yet, and where I think we need to move them is to those other two, the legal and the political. They're just not willing to engage on the political aspects of this that we really need to engage on if we're going to solve the problem. So that's my editorial. And now I want to kind of bring the rest of the panelists in. We have a couple minutes here to chat all together before we get to audience Q&A. If you have a question, I see that there are many already in the Q&A. Now is the time to start dropping them in. All of you in some way, shape, or form have kind of talked about alluded to, homelessness as a public health problem versus homelessness as an economic problem. And I'm wondering if you can be more explicit about that. Is it one or the other? Does one lead to the other? Are they inextricably linked? How do we think about those two things and how they sit together in this conversation? RS, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think it's both. And to me, the way in which public health is really helpful as a frame of reference is that we are all, unfortunately, currently living in a pandemic where we've all learned a ton about public health, and the way in which you think about a population level challenge like COVID or like homelessness, right? And to me, what that points us to is that we actually have an evidence base. We know how to address problems that are population health type problems, right? So if you live in California, you can pull up a dashboard in whatever part of the state you live in and look at how many cases of COVID there have been in the last week. You can look up how many deaths there have been, and you can slice that data by a bunch of different categories, and you can make informed decisions, and policymakers can make informed decisions about how to react to that data. And the reality is that today, in almost every part of California, if I lived there and I want to know what's the state of homelessness in my jurisdiction today, is it better or worse than it was a month ago? Nobody can tell you, right? And even the conversation about how would we agree on a set of measures around whether we're improving, what does good look like? Nobody can tell you. We don't have consensus on that shared end state. We don't have the quality data to track progress towards it. And so we can't iterate. We can't be nimble in looking at, hey, the case rate for COVID is going up. We got to make some changes. We got to be responsive to that data. So I think Tamika sort of nailed it, which is for a long time, we've been thinking about this as a problem that we approach with charity, right? Good for you. We're working to make sure that we can serve a lot of people, but we're not thinking about this as a solvable problem and one where we want to have clear outcome measures and end state, track progress towards it, and be dynamic. So I think the public health mental model is really helpful here.
Jason, do you want to weigh in on that?
I think it was well said. I don't know that I have much more to add other than to say that I think the response to homelessness is necessarily improving our education system. It's improving our public health system. It's improving our foster system. It's raising the minimum wage and creating universal health care. It's all of those things. I mean, those of us who are privileged enough to be housed in California, we've all fallen on hard times. I see Colleen saying the justice system. It's perhaps the most important. So yes, the answer is yes to all those systems. And I think the point I was going to make is that those of us who are privileged and fortunate to be housed, we've all fallen on hard times. And when we did, there was a system there that kept us from falling into homelessness. Maybe we didn't perceive it that way, right? Maybe we lost our parents and we were taken in by an aunt or an uncle. Maybe we found ourselves in legal trouble, but the justice system saw me as white and treated me differently. Maybe there's something that happened in my life that prevented me from falling into homelessness. But when every single system fails, homelessness is the result. And so I think the answer to how we fix those problems is we fix every single one of them, which is overwhelming and daunting and scary, and it feels impossible. So we start. And I'm not going to go through what we're doing in California to try to address those, because that's not the purpose of this Zoom. But you have to look at public K-12, right? You have to look at child savings accounts. You have to look at adolescent mental health. and down the line. Homelessness is not solvable just with housing. I think Ross said that, or someone said that. Homelessness is not just solvable with housing. Street homelessness, sleeping outside tonight, is solvable with housing, right? And I think that's sort of the difference. But I don't even remember the question. It's very daunting. But I think.
Speaking of questions, there are many in the Q&A, so I want to go there now. And I'm sorry.
Catherine, before you go there, sorry, I just wanted to round out this point to both Iris's and Jason's piece, right? We're not, everything that we've discussed is the result of why homelessness happens, right? These failed systems. But the fact of the matter is, when you have in the city and county of San Francisco, the area median income for Black households is $30,000 a year, and the average cost of a one-bedroom apartment is more than $3,500 a year, you best believe if we focused on both the economic problem and the housing problem, we're going to be so much closer to providing the supportive shifts around those other systems that will actually help folks move from sustaining poverty to actually thriving in their communities.
That's a great point. Marian, I'm going to invite you back in here now. There's a lot going on in the Q&A.
There sure is. First, I want to say thank you all so much for this amazing conversation. I know I've been just like clapping and nodding along in the background. And thank you to everyone who has come and been active in the chat and has asked so many questions in the Q&A. We won't be able to get to all of them, but I will start us off as soon as possible. So the first one is that we've been talking a lot about different, locality. So like local solutions, regional solutions, statewide, and then federal. I had a question in the chat about why are we always referring to the Biden administration for a state homelessness solution? Why not create a Golden State housing voucher? So I guess it would be great to get an overview of the relationship between federal and state responsibility and solutions for homelessness.
I think I'll take that one if that's all right. So look, it's a good question. It's a reasonable proposal, and it's something we should consider. I think like anything, it's just a matter of trade-offs, which makes you roll your eyes when I give that answer, right? But I'll go on the next Zoom I'll do, and we'll talk about, improving public transportation for working people so they're not car dependent, which is a climate change imperative. So there's it's just a series of trade-offs. And I think the point I made before, which perhaps provoked that question, Marian, that you just read, is comparing it to food stamps or healthcare, right? And we just got rid of the most regressive, worst president we've ever had in American history. And we've replaced that Trump administration with the Biden administration. So at least we have aligned values. The point I make there is that not everything can be the state's responsibility. We have a federal government on purpose that collects a significant amount of tax from us and has the ability to deficit spend. Right. And I think the fact of the matter is California will never be able to replace the federal government in terms of building and maintaining the social safety net. No one is asking the question, well, why don't we realign food stamps to the states? It's just not something we can afford with everything else that we have to do. Now, that's not a way of dismissing the question. The question is a reasonable one. And I think we're going to try to move. We have moved, and we will continue to try to move as quickly as we can towards patching those holes. And that's frankly what the $12 billion is. Look, we just finished a budget a couple months ago, and the biggest single policy investment was homelessness in that budget. So I think we're making strides. If the question is, and I don't think that this was the assertion, and so I don't want to be argumentative with a questioner who doesn't get to argue back, but if the idea was, well, forget the federal government, we should do it, we can't afford to do that. It's not sustainable for us. It would bankrupt us and all the other important things we need to do in terms of public education and our environmental goals and our social welfare goals. So it's really, we do need the federal government. And the question is, what can we do not only to advocate, but to patch those holes while Biden, Harris, and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer move us meaningfully more towards where we need to be.
Yeah, and I guess I will also add, as I mentioned at the top, this is increasingly a national issue, right? Like, so it's been an emergency in California for much longer, I think, but I think that, it's hard to draw the boundary, somewhere, right? And if you're not really tackling this at a national level, then you're not really going to be able to solve it state by state. because people move. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that before we go to the next question? All right, Marian, back to you.
All right, so now zooming into the local level, we had some questions about both localities that aren't as participatory in Project Roomkey and Project Homekey, and how we can either apply pressure or encourage these regions to take full advantage of these projects. And then on the other side, with the interesting land use waiver that Project Homekey has, can local governments who are enthusiastic and supportive of trying to build housing for unhoused people, can they use that land waiver for locally funded projects more broadly, or is it specifically scoped for Project Homekey? So kind of carrot stick action.
Maybe I'll take the second question, and perhaps Tamika, I can ask you to cover the first. So the short answer is the Homekey exemption applies to Homekey projects. I think we'd be very supportive of seeing an exemption considered by the legislature to create a broader exemption. So I guess the short answer to that question is we don't have it in law now. We would be supportive of that. What does exist is a broad Homekey exemption, and sorry for the wonkery, there's another funding stream, which we call HAP, which is an acronym that for the life of me, I cannot remember what it stands for, but it's what was otherwise the lifeblood of flexible funding to local governments. Early in the pandemic, the governor signed an executive order that says anyone who's using that particular money is also able to avail themselves of certain streamlining. So there's kind of two things at play here. And then LA has its own, LA City has its own exemptions that cover just LA. So there's a bit of a patchwork. I think to the second part of that question, we'd be open to, and in fact have pushed for broader. But we can get what we can get out of the legislature, and we've been happy with that so far. But we want to go further.
Okay, thanks. And then Tamika.
Yeah, I guess I would say jurisdictions who were enthusiastic about Homekey, a lot of those jurisdictions had a lot more capacity to go after those projects and had a lot of options in terms of the actual buildings that they could secure. What we see at All Home across the region is capacity is really uneven. You have a lot of communities who we literally were helping some of our communities fill out Homekey applications because they didn't have the internal staffing capacity to do it at the timeline that the state was requiring. So I don't actually think it's about intent or desire. It really is about both capacity. How much can the local governments have the capacity to go after these projects aggressively? Is there enough building types? What's been great is in 2.0, the state has really opened up the different types of buildings that you can go after with Homekey. We have some interim housing projects, which we think is a core part of the solution. In order to bring people indoors quickly, you need to have interim and not congregate shelter, but interim housing. We saw some great projects in Mountain View and in Santa Clara County and San Jose. So Homekey was able to fund different, Jason talked about housing on a continuum. We need permanent housing, we need interim housing, and we also need to be investing in prevention. And I think what we see is providing capacity within these jurisdictions to go after the capital dollars, but we haven't really talked about the lack of resources for services. And Homekey is figuring out a services package. But what we hear from a lot of our housing developers and others is that they want to have long-term services and operations costs so that they can operate these projects in perpetuity. And I think that continues to be a policy area that we have to work in partnership on.
I'd like to say one more thing on that. If it's sorry, Ross.
Just to quickly double down. I think, Tamika, your point about the sustainability here and making sure that resources are actually being able to be spent today, but in a way that improves the situation long term feels really crucial. And we've seen a ton of federal money during COVID come through. And the reality is that at a national level, a lot of that money has been slow to actually get dispersed out to the people and households who are experiencing housing crises. And if we pause to think about why that is, right? We're all talking about resource scarcity, it's very real, but why is it so slow for us to be able to operationalize supporting people with that money? The reality is the capacity is not there, the administrative burden, the paperwork, being able to actually sort of turn on the spigot and get the money out to the people who need it. So I think I just want to put a plug in that we jump straight to the housing, and yes, it's crucial, but the services and the actual overhead or the capacity that allows you to be able to serve those households is crucial too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. And I wanted to jump in on this to make sure it got touched on before we end. There's an eviction moratorium that no longer exists. And, the headlines for the last several months have been that this is going to massively increase homelessness or people losing their homes or being evicted. But at the same time had an announcement from the governor that everybody with back rent was going to get reimbursed or covered or whatever, but only like 6% of the money has moved out the door.
It's significantly higher than that.
I guess how are you thinking about that in the governor's office of like how do you prevent this coming?
So I'm stressed out about a lot of things right now, and I think the eviction issue is the one that is at the top of my list in terms of what I wake up worried about in the middle of the night. So just to level set with some facts, we do have an eviction moratorium in California. The Biden administrations and the national moratoriums have been repealed by the Supreme Court, and New York State's was struck down. California has an eviction moratorium in place through September 30th. And then starting October 1st, it's not an eviction moratorium. I won't call it that, but it's a protective regime where there's a new court process that we legislated that if a landlord moves to evict a low-income tenant, that eviction can't proceed until the tenant is put through the process to get back money to pay that rent. So therefore, no need to evict. So it's another layer of protection. We have several $1 billion to administer in this space. We are right now, depending on what day of the week it is, about 9th best out of all 50 states in terms of putting that money out. We're approaching $500 million administered through these rental assistance programs. A number of local governments are doing a very good job on that as well. And as you said, Catherine, the program does cover 100% of back rent for low-income tenants and also forward rent and also utilities. So there's a significant amount of funding there. We started slowly. Because we were building something new. We started slowly because we were very wary about fraud and abuse in this program. That has not materialized, in part because I think we've done a good job of putting safeguards in place. We've sped way up in the last couple of months. Tamika is a close partner on some of this work with us, so she can fact check me, PolitiFact me in real time here. But we're getting this thing moving.
Yeah, Tamika, do you want to weigh in? And then I think we have time for maybe one question or a couple rapid fire, Marianne.
Yeah, for sure. So Jason's talking about the state program. We encourage everyone to get in, who has back rent, arrearage, utilities. That is the place to go. There are local programs across the region that are doing this work as well. We have All Home in partnership with Bar High is releasing a eviction moratorium checklist next week. That's really going to give jurisdictions a toolkit to really think about what are the elements that you need to be having locally to support folks in your community who may be at risk of eviction. So I know Edie is going to put that information into the chat. It's been a really important partnership to work with the state on making sure that their program is low barrier and they're starting to get the cash out. And we as a community need to do that targeted outreach, making sure that this money is getting into the hands of the people who need it the most. So we're all staying up at night on this issue, and we should be, because the implications for our community are significant.
Marianne?
Well, yeah, it seems like we have time for one more question. So I'm going to throw this out to any of you. What can I do as an individual? What can people in the audience do to support their neighbors who might be facing eviction, or to support Project Homekey in their city? What else can I do to address homelessness more broadly as an engaged citizen?
Each of you want to give like a short answer to that one?
I'll kick it off and I'll be short. Speak up. I mean, folks who are against things are much better at being loud. And so I would say, speak up, write a letter, show up at your council meeting, support candidates to the extent you can, write checks to local elected officials, speak up. And because one voice in support can drown out a lot of voices that are in opposition. So speak up.
Yeah, I'll go next. Support housing. Any chance you get, if you ever think that homelessness is going to be solved by somebody getting mental health or substance abuse treatment or increased health services, those do not help a person who first needs housing. So if there is a housing project at your city council, that anywhere in your community, say yes, because we need to understand that housing first is the way that we tackle this issue. Secondly, use your community assets. Don't be afraid to talk about homelessness and its related effects that we've been talking about this whole hour. When our economy is failing poor people, we're going to have homelessness, full stop. When we have acceptable communities where tents and degradation of our seniors and elders are a part of a societal norm, we can fight against that and make that a place in our dinner tables and at our city councils and federal legislation that is not okay.
Yes, I know we're at time. I'll just add, expect results, right? Just like with anything else, we've got to view homelessness as a problem that can actually be solved, and to expect meaningful progress, and to ask folks, how are we doing? How is the situation being improved? And what are you doing about it? And again, because I'm me, I'll plug, make sure that they're talking about data around outcomes and not just outputs, right? Not how many people are we helping, but how many more people are there to be helped? And is that number shrinking over time?
That's a great point to end on. I mean, I feel like we've just scratched the surface of what is possible to talk about. I will say, like, we are doing this under the umbrella of our 501c3 nonprofit organization. So we are able to inform you that there is an election happening in California, and that you should learn about that election and vote in that election. And you should have gotten a ballot in the mail. We've got plenty of resources on our website that we'll share with you all. We'll be sending a follow-up email with the link to this recording. Please share with your networks. Please sign up for our newsletter so you can hear about more things that we're doing and other ways to plug in to our work. Thank you to our panelists for joining us for this really important conversation, and really appreciate all of the work that all three of you are doing to help us solve this problem. Have a great afternoon, everybody.